Welcome to this EU Green Week partner event organized by the European Public Health Alliance, EFA. It is our honor at EFA to host this event today to contribute to the zero pollution narrative from a public health angle. My name is Matteo Barisione, and I'm a policy officer at EFA, and I will be the moderator of this event. Before starting our event, may I make a few housekeeping rules? This event will be recorded and recordings will be available after the event. You can contribute to the debate by using the chat box, and we will make sure that your comments and questions will be brought forward to the debate. Our event will look answers to two questions. What is the impact of non-tailpipe emissions on our health? And how can we mitigate the impacts of non-exhaust emissions through technology and EU regulation? To this end, the event of today will be in two panels. The first one will explain why non-exhaust emissions are an underrated health issue. And after a short break of 5 minutes, the second panel will focus on the political and technical solution that can solve this problem. So the aim of this event is to present a comprehensive overview of this topic, providing space for discussion. And with the permission of the speakers, we will share with the audience their presentation after the event. Speakers will have 5 minutes to give their presentation in order to have more time for the questions. And indeed, we are also here together to hear your views and allow as many questions and comments as possible. Use the chat function under Zoom. Even during the presentation, do not hesitate to post your questions and comments in the chat box. My colleagues and I will constantly monitor them, and we will make sure, and I will make sure after each panel to bring them to the discussion. We have a live tweet for the event on our Twitter account, EFA_EU, and you can also share your comments with the hashtag Clean Air Healthy Cities and EU Green Week. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to my colleague Zoltán Masai-Kusebek, who is Policy Manager for Clean Air and Healthy Recovery at EFA. Zoltán, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and welcome everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for joining us this event on tackling the health impacts of non-exhaust road emissions. For those who don't know us, EFA is the largest public health NGO in Europe with more than 85 member organizations. We unite healthcare professionals, academia, disease-specific groups, patients, and the population group representatives. And I'm pleased to see many of them also here with us today. We all have shared values and interest in better health in Europe for all and in leaving no one behind. The mission of EFA is to advocate better health for Europe, reduce health inequalities, and build public health capacity. To give you a context for today's discussions, one of the key global public health concerns which requires more and more attention from EFA and from our members is air pollution. As a discipline, public health aims to create the enabling conditions for people to maintain their health, improve health and well-being, and prevent ill health or deterioration of their health. Public health focuses on the root causes. Air pollution is a prime example of an environmental risk factor where individual level changes are either unavailable or inefficient. So that makes coordinated action, especially at societal level, absolutely essential. EFA applies the public health approach to air pollution and more specifically to transport. We started developing evidence to better understand the interlinkages between health and transport in collaboration with CEDELF, an environmental consultancy agency based in the Netherlands. So far, we produced 3 studies together. The first study examines the health impacts and health costs of diesel emissions in the EU. This study includes policy analysis pointing out that stringent emission policies can dramatically reduce the societal damage costs of air pollution and enable governments and health insurers to make significant cost savings. In 2020, our attention was drawn to the global epidemic, and we started to discover the various links between COVID-19 and air pollution. Recently emerging evidence suggests that exposure to air pollution worsens the severity of COVID-19 on people's health. Updated evidence on COVID-19 points to the need for improved air quality standards and the transition away from polluting fossil fuels. Subsequent lockdowns in many cities demonstrated clearly that carbon dioxide emissions, air pollution, and noise level can be significantly reduced, while urban space for walking and cycling, the active forms of mobility, could be increased dramatically, improving both our environment and our health. Then we were focusing on cities where 2/3 of Europeans live. More than 80% of people living in urban areas that monitor air pollution are exposed to air pollution, which then exceed the World Health Organization limits. Low income or other disadvantaged populations are the most impacted. So with that background, the second study of Tradeoffs, published in October 2020, calculated the health costs of air pollution in 432 European cities. This study also looked into small changes to transport habits and city policies impacting, for example, the journey time to work or car ownership, which can make a substantial difference to such health costs. And finally, we released the third study quite recently in March this year on air pollution and transport policies at city level. This report analyzes 28 types of urban policies currently running in a host of cities around Europe, from zero-emission public buses to sharing e-scooters. Its aim is to see their effect on particulate matter and nitrogen oxide reductions from traffic. For instance, the study finds that banning polluting vehicles could cut harmful particulate matter and nitrogen oxide pollution in cities of over 1 million residents up to 23% and 36% respectively. Mayors and city leaders can therefore play a significant role in tackling social costs of city-level air pollution. Following those studies, IFA has formulated policy recommendations to help them implement targeted policy interventions to improve people's health and the environmental. As I said at the beginning, we are advocating better health in Europe, and in that policy area, we are in favor of more stringent vehicle emission standards. That's why we urge the EU and national governments to end the sale of new diesel and petrol vehicles by 2035 at the very latest, while progressively phasing out existing polluting vehicles from urban areas. So I think it is not exaggerated to state that the impact of fossil fuel cars is catastrophic on our health and on our environment. We know that engines are not the only problem. That's why we are here today. Non-tailpipe emissions like brakes and tire wear are part of the problem, and actually it is a growing problem. In fact, non-exhaust emissions from brakes, tires, and road abrasions have overtaken exhaust emissions as the dominant source of particulate matter emissions from transport in Europe. Yet, until now, non-exhaust emissions are unregulated. As part of the European Green Deal, the European Commission has announced more stringent air pollutant emission standards for vehicles. The new standards, the Euro 7 ones, will be presented by the end of 2021, and it is crucial that they help accelerate the shift to zero-emission vehicles. The new vehicle emission standards, Euro 7, will be a key moment. For the first time, the European Commission will be considering setting limits for particle emissions from brakes. So with those ideas in mind, I'm looking forward to learning more today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zoltan. The first panel will explain what non-exhaust emissions are and why they are important health issues. I'm pleased to introduce our panelist expert that will answer all your questions on non-exhaust emission. First of all, Catherine Farrow from the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. You are the co-author of the recent report on non-exhaust particulate emissions from road transport. Good afternoon, Catherine. Maurizio Maggiore, hello, and Maurizio Maggiore from the DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. You work on the automotive branch on the reduction of polluting emissions and the increase in efficiency of conventional engines as well as the electrification and hydrogen fuel cell technology in road transport applications. Good afternoon, Maurizio.
Hello, I cannot activate the video. I hope you hear me. Thank you for the invitation.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, now
Thank you.
Perfect.
Yes, thanks.
And Professor Fleming Cassey, an inhalation toxicologist from the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and Environment. You also work on the safety of nanomaterials. Good afternoon, Fleming. And Julia Wadou, Policy Coordinator for Health, Accessibility, Mobility and New Technologies at AGE Platform Europe, a European network of non-profit organizations of and for people aged 50 plus. Good afternoon, Julia.
Good afternoon.
Catherine Farrow, could you tell us more about your study on non-exhaust particulate emissions from road transport? Your report initiates our interest in this question, especially with this subtitle, an ignored environmental policy challenge. The floor is yours.
So yes, this is indeed somewhat of a controversial subtitle, and that was deliberate. One of the objectives of this report was to raise the visibility of this issue among policymakers at all levels of government who may not have been previously aware of it, and among the public as well. So I'll just be going through the main messages from the report. So there are three main messages that the report presents. The first is that the evidence we review reflects the scientific consensus that non-exhaust emissions have negative impacts on human health. The second is that in our comparison of the emissions emitted by electric vehicles and conventional vehicles, we find that although electric vehicles emit less total particulate matter than conventional vehicles, they may emit more non-exhaust particulate matter, and the non-exhaust emissions that they do emit are comprised of relatively more tire wear than that what's emitted from conventional vehicles. And as a result, the main policy implication is that there's a need to develop and implement policies to address non-exhaust emissions, and that electric vehicles, because they do produce these emissions, they should be subject to these policies as well. Next, please. Thanks. So just to reiterate the background, the importance of the issue, to set the stage as a reminder of why we're interested in non-exhaust emissions in the first place. As was mentioned earlier, although we've seen emission standards reduce particulate matter from exhaust emissions over the years, this isn't the case for non-exhaust emissions. And here we have some data from the EU, which shows that particulate matter from non-exhaust sources has been comprising an increasing share of total particulate matter from road transport. And so the observation here is that now that we're well on our way to reducing exhaust emissions, we should be turning our attention to addressing how to reduce non-exhaust emissions. Next, please. So the first message of the report is that particulate matter has well-established and wide-ranging impacts on health. Just to go through kind of a laundry list of the documented associations between exposure to PM, especially PM 2.5, and a number of conditions, including cardiovascular, respiratory, neurological conditions, reproductive complications, high blood pressure, diabetes, and other markers of systemic inflammation more generally. As I understand, this will be addressed in more detail later in the panel session. Next. So the second message concerns particulate matter emissions factors. The report estimates that when considering all particulate matter, including primary and secondary exhaust emissions, as well as non-exhaust emissions, electric vehicles emit less particulate matter than conventional vehicles. And this is presented in tables 3.4 and 3.5 of the report. So if we zoom in on non-exhaust emissions, more specifically, the picture is a bit different. So here we have an example result from the report showing PM 2.5 emission factors for different vehicle classes, passenger cars, SUVs, and light commercial vehicles. And so for each class of vehicle, we compared the non-exhaust emissions emitted from a conventional gasoline-powered vehicle with those from a lightweight electric vehicle and a heavier weight electric vehicle. And there are two main observations from these estimations. We see that electric vehicles produce less brake wear which is the gray bars, and as much or more tire wear than conventional vehicles. And this is especially the case for heavier vehicles. And we see this both within and across vehicle classes. So as a result, we also see that heavier electric vehicles are in fact estimated to emit slightly more PM 2.5 from non-exhaust emissions than their conventional counterparts. And so the message that issues from these results is that electric vehicles will not contribute to significantly alleviating this issue of non-exhaust emissions, and that they may even increase PM 2.5 emissions from non-exhaust sources. Next, please. So given these findings, the report provides an overview of some of the measures that could be considered to address non-exhaust emissions. And these measures span different levels of government, different timeframes. In the near term, policymakers could consider, for example, the more widespread implementation of urban vehicle access regulations, as well as measures to encourage both consumers to buy lighter weight vehicles and producers to produce them. In the long term, there's a need to establish recognized measurement practices and to measure these emissions, and perhaps even consider standards for non-exhaust emissions as well, which I understand we'll be hearing about more about later in the session. So with that, and with an eye on the clock, I will conclude. We very much welcome your comments and questions later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Your suggested policy responses are very interesting for the second panel, as the EU is able to regulate these pollution sources, and we have research and development representatives with us. Maurizio Maggiore from the European Commission, you look into how to reduce polluting emissions. You attended this morning the EU Green Week event on the exhaust and non-exhaust emissions, putting transport research and health impacts in perspective. What can you tell us about this topic?
Thank you. Yes, this morning I coordinated this panel, and in reality, we were trying to touch some of the things that we have we have talked about up to now, because we have been doing research on this since 6-7 years ago, the first projects on brake. And so I wanted to bring this to the public. So next slide. I basically stole some slides from the speakers of this morning, just to exactly give a kind of synthesis. What came out was that, yes, PM is the only indicator we have. So that's, of course, what we are using. But all the speakers, starting here from Miriam Herlof's Nederland, for instance, the point is that health impact is made of many parts, of which PM, the mass, is only one. And all the speakers more or less highlighted the fact that what is within that particulate makes a difference. So the composition, the size. So it's a multidimensional problem in which hazard in the end depends on all these parameters. So here, for instance, it says PMS is dominated by larger particles like tires, but the particle number is dominated by the smaller particles, and that makes a big difference for certain of the health impacts, for instance. So this kind of one size fits all can be sometimes a bit misleading. Next slide, please. For instance, one of the researchers from Paul Scherrer Institute presented, Professor Dallenbach, the comparison at, let's say, with mass and some tests of oxidative potential. And you see that even the different tests don't have the same result for the different emissions. And PM10, for instance, has a quite different effect on some of the effects compared with PM 2.5. So the picture is even more complicated when you look at specific impacts. This is one of the health impacts that we have. Next slide. Here, this is a result of one of our projects that showed that you can design a pad which on one end has less emissions, so less number in this case, and at the same time design it to be less toxic. Is the green one, and you see that is much lower than the two, let's say, existing pads with which it was compared. So we can do something about it, looking at also the composition. Next slide. Another approach has been taken by a Ukrainian researcher, Professor Klimenko, that just went for the composition of all the emissions. In this case, it's not only particles, it's all emissions from certain vehicle categories, with a reference to carbon monoxide, which is toxicity 1, and then how more toxic other components are. He took all this, he basically added up the quantities times the factor, and next slide, he arrived at this ranking of the different type of vehicles. And you see that the non-exhaust component, for instance, in this case, which is basically only tires or mainly tires for the electric vehicles, compare with all the other emissions, because we are not only have particles from cars, we have, for instance, polyaromatics, we have a lot of other things which are very dangerous, very toxic. So he put, let's say, this picture of the different toxicities of the different type of vehicles. And finally, next slide. We had another project that I launched called Tube, which was looking at the effects of nanoparticles, because I think that's another underestimated effect, which is hidden somewhere in the PM2.5 and the PM10, but mixed with a lot of other things. Here we're looking only at nanoparticles and on the effect on brain in this presentation. And it's clear that there are specific impacts which are only coming from these particles, and therefore it's important to let's say have also a look at these, because if we just limit, yes,
can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. You don't? Do you hear me? Hello? Do you hear me?
Sorry.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
we had a problem. Could you please say that again?
Yeah, no, I was saying that in this particular presentation, they looked at the nanoparticles, so the finest part of the exhaust particulate, and they saw specific effects. So another warning they gave is to try also to address with research and let's say regulation this part. And I know that this is difficult because at the moment we are not measuring nanoparticles separately, and therefore it's a kind of loop that we cannot regulate something if we are not measure it. And I think this is the last slide, so thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. I also attended this event this morning, and I warmly recommend you to listen to the video if you missed it. It's also the opportunity for us to thank the European Commission for organizing the EU Green Week. Epidemiological studies link PM pollutant exposure to dementia, a great health issues for older people, and we will talk about it later with Julia Wadou. I see a question on the slides of our speakers. With their permissions, we will share with the audience their presentation after the event. And even during the presentation, do not hesitate to post your questions and comments in the chat function under Zoom. Professor Fleming-Cassé, you are also involved in research into adverse health effects from airborne particulate matter and gaseous components in the ambient air. Could you explain the health effects of non-tile particles and especially brake dust? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to have to be part of the discussion. So the question was, can I tell something about the hazard of brake dust? Next slide, please. So next. So for that, I just want to show you a figure that shows the very complex situation that we have if you look at particulate matter. I mean, particles are there in different shapes, sizes, and composition, and range for from very nice cuboidal ones, which often is sea salt, but you also see fibers, etc. And in the left top corner, you also see breakwear particles. So the mixture is quite complex, yet the regulations are such that all particles are treated as being equally toxic. We have a mass-based standard for PM2.5 and PM10, but from a toxicological perspective, we do know that there's a huge range in the toxicity potency of various particles. Next. I want to be very brief today and just show you a few examples. Part of it has already been showed also this morning by Miriam Gerlos. This is one example where we indeed ask the question, okay, traffic is more than just tailpipe emissions. So why don't we look at how reactive the particles are that are released from the various parts of traffic? And that means that we've collected particles from a diesel engine or an engine that was running on biodiesel and compared it with a sample from tire and road wear, which is very difficult to separate in itself. I mean, there's the friction between the tire and road, and that makes a mixture. Often we see that these particles are relatively large. Unless you have studded tires, then you also get very small particles released. And then we had the opportunity to collect also particles from various brake pads. And what I'd like to show you here is, and I hope you can understand what we do here, is in our lungs, we have a good defense mechanism that protects us to many chemicals. One of it is vitamin C, and you all know that vitamin C is good for you, as it's an antioxidant. And we use this biochemical to mix it with the particles and to see to what extent there's a reaction. So if the vitamin C is used, it will tell us something about reactivity of the material. As long as you have enough vitamin C in your body, in this case in your lung, you're probably very well protected. But as soon as that is depleted, then you run into another problem. So here we have a positive control, which is an oil fly ash, just to show you what the range of effects can be. And the comparison that I want to show here is that on average, you will see that the brake particles are more reactive, more potent, I would say. It's not really toxicity what I express here, but it tells you something about the reactivity of the material. But at the same time, you also see that, for instance, the brake wear particles too are not that potent and end up in more or less the same range as the tire and road wear. So there's a large variability in the potency of this material. So in this case, we identified that copper is quite high in the three large bars, whereas the brake wear part 2 has very little copper in here. So if you're approaching this in a very simplistic way, you would say, okay, ban copper from brake pads because that's causing a problem. Next slide, please. Now, this is a test tube test. In the end, you want to see what the effect is in the entire organism. So we also have done studies in experimental animals where we looked at the dose response, concentration response relationship for all these particles that we've collected. And on top of that, we also combine it with wood stove and poultry farm particles. Now, it might be difficult to appreciate what I try to show here, but the bars here represent the potency, and the more they are to the left of the screen, the higher the potency is, in this case, to induce inflammatory responses in the lung. And here you will see that the brake wear particles are relatively high in their toxic potency. But at the same time, you also see that there is a variability, and the particles with high copper are not necessarily always the ones that have the strongest effect. So there is more than only the copper that is determining the response in these animals. And in addition to that, you can also look at the diesel material, which is kind of in between here. So next. Now, this is another study not performed by us, but it's taken from a study in the UK, where they used the part of the lung in which are alveolar macrophages. Macrophages are cells that are freely moving around in our lungs and are there as a kind of a vacuum cleaner. They clean up our lungs with all the debris that is deposited there, including particles, viruses, and bacteria. And as shown here on the right in that figure, this is the gas exchange here. This is the alveolus, where the function is there to exchange oxygen and CO2. But that macrophage is there to make sure that the particles are removed and cleared. So what they did here is they compared dust from brakes with diesel particles, a standard reference material here, and they concluded that overall, despite the high abundance of metals in brake dust, the toxic potency of both dust was relatively the same. And that, but you can also reverse it and say, okay, mind you, we have taken put a lot of attention in exhaust related particles from diesel, but there's a lot more there, and also brake particles can cause a similar type of responses. And this is just one response. I mean, this is lung, and you have to go beyond the lung to see what actually the effects are. And Maritje already mentioned that. That's also in the TUBE project. We look at different aspects on neurological effects, and you can also look at heart function, etc. So there's a lot more to look at. Next slide, please. So I just want to summarize a couple of statements here that I would say that on average, you can conclude that brake dust and non-tailpipe particles can be equally or more potent than tailpipe diesel, let's say diesel particles. Size, and I didn't show you that specifically, has a major impact on what kind of adverse health effects you can have. If they really become into the ultrafine size range, so nano-sized particles, they have a very different impact than when you have large particles. And lastly, you have to put the toxic potency in perspective of exposure. I mean, we all talk about the risk of being affected by the air pollution. That's a multiplication of being exposed and knowing what the hazard is. And in general, the exposure to brake dust and other null-type emissions will be lower than the tailpipe emissions, at least at present, and will change in the near future, of course. But maybe at hotspots, the situation can be highly dominated by brake dust, etc. So I'll leave it with there, and I hope to see some interesting discussions here. Oh, lastly, I do want to emphasize, the introduction was kind of, well, I would not say negative, but not that optimistic. I do want to emphasize that the policy on air pollution has been quite effective since the 70s, and dramatic reduction in air pollution has been achieved over the past couple of decades, and also the projections are that air pollution is going down. Still, there is work to be done. I mean, some areas are reaching WHO guideline values, not standards, but there are more opportunities to reduce health effects even further than we already have done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Your statement that brake dust can be equally or more potent than tailpipe diesel particles is compelling. The health effects of diesel are well known now, and especially on vulnerable people, such as older people. Let me introduce Julia Wadou from Age Platform Europe. You present a vulnerable group that suffers from air pollution. And why are air pollution and non-exhaustive emissions a key concern, especially for older people?
So, good afternoon, everyone. So as Matteo said, I'm Julia. I'm working for Age Platform Europe. It's a European network which gathers 100 organizations of older people aged 50 plus, and we do advocate for the well-being and the rights of older people. We are working closely with IFA for quite a long time, and what we would like to bring here is indeed the perspective of older people, but more generally, how much people in vulnerable situations are at risk when it comes to air pollution. Next slide, please. Yeah, So I'm sure that you are very familiar with this kind of statistics, and what we can highlight here is that, well, basically in 2020, more than 1/5 of the EU population was aged 65 plus and over. And what I can say as well is that the share of people aged 80 years or above is projected to represent almost 15% of the population by the end of the century. Today, those persons are representing more or less 6% of the EU population. Next slide, please. Still, behind those cold statistics, there are people. And I would like to bold that all the people are not an homogeneous group. That might sound obvious, but it's important to bear in mind. Therefore, air pollution will impact all the individuals differently, depending on their socioeconomic backgrounds, place of living, their state of health or disability, their gender, etc. So all in all, it's not that because you are an older person, you are vulnerable, but let's say that the context in which you have age is playing an important role. If we reduce the individual to their chronological age, we will miss the complexity of the situation. So having a more detailed, disaggregated approach is better to capture the reality of inequalities and to identify the context in which vulnerabilities are more important so that we make sure we do not leave someone behind. Let's be clear, air pollution is positive for no one's health. According to the 2020 Air Quality Life Index report, particulate pollution cuts global life expectancy by nearly 2 years, but those in vulnerable situations are even more affected. Next slide, please. What are the impacts of air pollution on older people's health? Well, older people are more likely to be faced with chronic health conditions, such as cardiovascular and respiratory disease. This obviously increases their vulnerability to air pollution, like younger ones with asthma, for example. If we dive into disaggregated data, we also know that in England, for example, compared to the wealthiest, the poorest men and women aged 50 plus are twice likely to have a respiratory illness and therefore to be also impacted even more by air pollution. In 2016, a study published in The Lancet found that long-term exposure to air pollution contributes to the progression of heart disease. Older people and those with hypertension at large are the most vulnerable to these health effects. And there are also emerging evidence, as Maurizio was showing, that exposure to airborne pollutants is associated with increased risk of dementia. So obviously, depending on the area where you are living, your exposure to air pollution will differ. But still, not everyone can decide where to live and to make the decision moving far from major roads. Even if the studies and data are too few at the moment, what has been published already demonstrates that air pollution is putting at stake basic human rights, like the right to life and to health. A human rights-based approach is quite of an interesting perspective and angle to challenge the current situation as well. It also encourages to adopt a participatory approach that is particularly powerful at local level, because it can help first to address the needs and lifestyle of all citizens, including older people, for example, to plan mobility in a more inclusive way. It can also increase the knowledge and the exchange of experiences on complex topics like air pollution, notably non-exhaust emission. And it can thus facilitate awareness raising and the adoption of new solutions by citizens. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to highlight some potential political hooks to move forward the agenda beyond the ones which are, let's say, more obvious when speaking about air pollution and non-exhaust emission. First of all, the current EU trio presidency is committed to aging issues with a clear references to health promotion and the improvement of the quality of life. The European Commission published a green paper on aging in end of January of this year, and there is a clear mention of the impact of environmental degradation and pollution on older people's health, and there is a clear link to the Green Deal as well. And the last two important hooks could be also the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, which has been recently launched for 2021 until 2030. And there is one action area dedicated to age-friendly cities and communities, which can be a powerful lever to improve air quality, working with local authorities, of course. And last but not least, I would like to mention the release by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights of a report on the human rights impacts of climate change on older persons. So it's larger, of course, but still very important. And with that, yeah, I would like to thank you very much, and I'll give the floor back to Matteo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Yes, an increased exposure to particulate matter may even be fatal for them, for older people. What is true for older people is true for all the vulnerable groups, such as children, patients with chronic conditions. Tackling non-exhaust emission is really a matter of life and death. Julia, you're right. There is a political momentum in Europe to address this issue. We'll talk more about the political and technical solution in the second panel. Stay tuned. And now we can open the discussion. And if we have received questions from the audience, and you can still send us your questions on the chat box. The other panelists can react to any question. And let's start with a question from Theodoros Grogorotos. I hope that I pronounced well, from the European Joint Research Center, I suppose. And it's a question for Catherine Farrell. Are these experimental data were similar types of vehicles compared in each category? I mean, vehicles with similar mass and inertia. And did you take into account the reduction of tire emission due to less braking?
Thanks very much for the question. These are not original experimental data that we measure for this report. We base the calculation of the emissions factors on those cited in the European Environment Agency's air pollutant emissions inventory guidebook. And for the vehicle classes, we essentially assumed made assumptions to reflect the fact that vehicles are the same in as many aspects as possible across conventional vehicles and electric vehicles within vehicle classes. So we do try to compare similar types of vehicles. And regarding the impact of regenerative braking systems on non-exhaust emissions, we do take into account significant reductions in brake wear emissions for the electric vehicles that use regenerative braking systems. On the other hand, increased torque of electric vehicles, there's some evidence that would suggest that, insofar as this increases the friction and the acceleration of vehicles, that this would actually lead to increasing tire wear emissions.
Thank you very much. And we have also a question for Maurizio Maggiore, or maybe you also, Catherine Farrell. Is there any research available on exhaust emissions and the quality of road pavement? And that's a question from Silke Conrad.
We have a project which just launched on tire, and by, let's say, automatically, it will also include something on pavement. And that will look at all aspects from the, let's say, measurement, the source, and the fate in air or in the ground, because we also want to look into the microplastic issue, which is deriving from the same source. And I would say probably more than the air one, because in big particles like that don't stay in the air for long; they end up in the ground. But from a toxicological point of view, that will also look at that. I think in the literature there's not much, but from what we have seen in the last presentations, for instance, the one Professor Cassé, it seems like it's low, the impact.
I don't know, maybe Professor, do you want to say something about this question?
I have to be careful what we mean with impact. I mean, impact is indeed how a population is impacted in terms of health effects. And I agree with those types of particles are usually fairly large, difficult to be inhaled. They travel very, very long. So the actual exposure or inhalation is quite low compared to the more combustion-related particles that we have in our air. For brake, it might be a little bit different because there you see that due to the high temperatures, you also get very small particles released.
Perhaps I would just add that in our report we do review the literature on the impact of the generation of road wear, and there is some work that's been done on the characteristics of roads, like the porosity, and then the material of the road, and the quality of the road, insofar as it's new or very old. So there is some material in the report on that. And I would also add regarding the calculation of emission factors, I would point anyone interested in those two tables, 3.1 and 3.2 of the report as well.
Thank you very much. We have also a question from Jutta Paulus. Did anyone research particle emissions from rail transport?
We have a topic in the next work program, the first work program Horizon Europe, exactly looking at retrofitting or at capturing and retrofitting a rail, because there is evidence that brake and iron dust, particularly in close environment like underground stations or underground railway stations, can pose a problem. And the toxicity is more or less the same for the brakes for cars or.
Do you want to add anything else on this topic? Thank you. Yes, still, Maurizio, you said that something about the tube and Alzheimer-like impacts also in children. Can you explain?
Yes, since I had 5 minutes, I couldn't take, but there was a very interesting result that they presented this morning, and the presentation will be public, so anybody's interested, where Professor Kaninen said that they are seeing cognitive and really physical impact in the cells in young people. So it's not only old people, but nanoparticles are impacting also the youngest generation. So that's why I'm concerned with the nanoparticle, because you see the results in many years. We are not measuring them. We don't know where they are, how many they are, and we are comparing them with the particles which are, many times. I mean, just to give an example, a number that many people don't probably, a particle of 2.5 micrometer, which is what we regulate, the biggest that we regulate, contains, with the same mass, 2.5 million particles of 20 nanometers. So we are comparing something which is really non-comparable. To say that you have so many milligrams of one and so many milligrams of the other is missing a big part. And if the effects are these, for instance, we might not see them.
So just to add to this, because obviously within PM 2.5 you have also ultrafine particles that are included. But for those smart particles, as you mentioned, we might consider a different metric. And then what you also see, what can be used also in epidemiological studies is counting the number of particles that are in air, rather than looking at what the total mass is of that small size fraction. By the way, I think we do know a lot about those, in particular if you combine it with all the knowledge that we've gained from the nanomaterial research. And in fact, a matter of fact, not that long ago, we published a paper showing what the similarities are between nanoparticles and ultrafine particles as such. So there's a lot of information. And on top of that, I mean, I'm also partner in that same tube project, Maurizio. What we also know is that the particles can actually, because they are so small, they can easily translocate to other parts in the body, including direct translocation to the brain by inhalation in the nose. And we do have evidence that it might accelerate neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, etc. But that's still quite weak evidence. It's a little bit supported by epidemiology, but there is evidence. But that's not specific for those brake or non-tailpipe particles. That also apply to diesel particles. Interesting with the diesel particles, by the way, is that we do see that the hazard or the toxicity of those particles actually are look to be decreased because there's a better fuel combustion process. There is less pHs absorbed on those particles, and if you purely take the carbon particles, that is the core of diesel soot. Those are in itself not that hazardous. It's usually the chemical that's absorbed on the surface that is translocated very deep into the lung because those particles are that small. And that could easily apply also to small particles from non-tailpipe emissions. Yeah,
one thing maybe that you mentioned diesel. We had a research project that we funded on ultrafines engine emission. And we found that natural gas engine, so an engine that in many countries is deemed to be clean, had 1,000 times the number of particles of a diesel if you looked small enough. In the sense that these particles were 2, 3, 5 nanometers. So even smaller than the diesel ones.
Exactly, and that's because the current emission regulations stop at 23 nanometer, and that's the same applies to emission from turbine engine from aircraft.
Yes.
Also 10, 20 nanometers. Huh?
Yep.
Thank you very much. And now I have a question also for Julia Wadou. How can we raise the visibility on the air pollution to vulnerable people?
So I think one of the things I mentioned was, this issue of the participatory approach, making sure that indeed we can transform all this knowledge in something that can be digested by everyone, because it's somehow difficult, and I think it's something really important. And this is what this human rights-based approach that we are strongly advocating for is important, because it's a way to engage people, making sure they are aware. And you have more and more experiences, actually, even I've just read that in Brussels, they are starting this kind of experiences where citizens can actually take part into the research, trying to measure the state of the air pollution in front of the house, or doing it for the schools as well. So that is something that, can help as well, people being more aware. Coming back to the issue of, how much impact these kind of things have on children, older people, or whatever, I think what is important is, trying to have this life course perspective approach, because, we know that whatever is happening in the early childhood will have an impact in long term as well in the way people will age. And this is why I emphasize the issue of, the aging dimension, in the sense that we are all aging at some point, and the inequalities are actually growing up. The more you have been growing up in an unequal situation, the more difficulties you will have when you will get older. So this is indeed really, really important to make sure that we touch upon those issues and start from the early childhood to tackle those points and make sure that it will have a long-term impact.
Thank you. Yes, this question is really important of how we can explain this topic to the general audience, general public. I have also a question, and this is I think for all of you. Just here, how can the panelists see the trade-offs between climate change and air pollution, and especially the link with electrical vehicles, and should EV longer use this technique to reduce as much as possible braking, the technique of capture energy?
I can comment on what we are doing in 2.0, which is the platform that will be launched in Horizon Europe on zero-emission vehicles. And the stress there, as far as non-exhaust particles are concerned, will be exactly on control. So you have the tool of regenerative braking that can affect the brake particles, but as Theo Gregoratos hinted, it can also reduce, and it does reduce in my view, because I have an electric vehicle and I see my tires are lasting much longer than my previous car, can reduce the emissions of particles by reducing braking and by reducing the slip when you accelerate. So we will ask researchers to look into this and design application logics, let's say, control logics that also include minimization of these particles, while at the same time, it's in their interest for the car manufacturers, because if you recuperate more energy, you have the same battery making more kilometers, and so they can propose to the customers a better product.
Thank you. Catherine, if you want to explain your position.
Sure. I think that the trade-offs involved in addressing these two different policy objectives really depend on the approach taken. So the damages from non-exhaust emissions on human health can be addressed by reducing the amount of emissions produced and also or by reducing the exposure. So basically taking people away from the areas where there are emissions. But because where there's cars, there will be also people. Reducing emissions by either reducing the number of vehicle kilometers traveled or by reducing the amount of emissions emitted per vehicle kilometer traveled would be preferable in the long run. So reducing the number of vehicle kilometers traveled will have obvious alignment with climate objectives. Reducing emissions emitted per vehicle kilometer traveled could depend highly on the technology that's used to do this. For example, if there's some technologies that are highly carbon intensive in the way that they're produced, this could be an instance where there might be a trade-off that exists between the climate objective and an objective of reducing non-exhaust emissions.
Yeah, so two small comments on this one. One is, I think we also need to think about not only controlling emissions as such, but it's also a matter of behavioral, and that how do you run your car? And Mauricio, if you have now an electrified car, you know that it's quite fast in going from 1 to 0. And that kind of behavior creates a lot of particles if you do that. So it's also a bit of behavior, how to run your car, etc., as well as making sure that there's not much interference in your driving. So avoid congestion, etc. That would also reduce the emissions. That's just another aspect, of course. In the wider picture, I would also take into account that somewhere the energy for those electrified engines have to be generated, and that in itself can also create pollution. Luckily, that's probably not the diffuse source, but those can be controlled. But if the batteries are produced in China, where they don't care that much about air pollution as we do, then you still have on the global scale, you can create a problem, but you just shift it to another area. So that's also a word of caution, that we can be very clean here, but make sure that also what we import has also been produced in a clean way, avoiding air pollution to be released.
Well, on that, I think I would like to stress that we are preparing the Fit for 55 package, which is looking at all these aspects. I can assure you that battery production, for instance, is covered, border adjustment so that we don't import cheap stuff done elsewhere where they are not covering for the environment. So we are trying to have really a comprehensive approach on that. And about the driving, I think that if you know electric car driver, you know that the moment you have an electric car, you drive softly. because otherwise you'd have less range. So I think there is a psychological effect that yes, the car can do 0 to 100, but excluding a few people that in the past were called piston head, that probably will do it anyway, but they would do it also in their Corvette or in their Mustang, so it doesn't change much. All the other people tend to drive in a better way, and I think their communication would be great to convince people that sexy is not having the most, but is doing the more distance, do a competition who does more kilometers with one charge or something like this. That is the kind of mind adjustment that we need to put into people, also that they contribute to reducing the consumption, because even if it's electricity, it will, as you say, need to be produced. And even if it's regenerative electricity, renewable electricity, still, if you're using it badly, it will be missing somewhere else. So I think that the logic has to be adjusted.
Thank you very much for this fruitful discussion, and we have a lot of other questions, but we'll, in case your question was not fully answered, or if you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to address them to IFA. You can send them to Matteo at ifa.org, and we'll put it on the chat box, and we will communicate it to the speakers, and after the event, we'll circulate a summary of the event with the answer of these questions, and as well as the video recording. Welcome back to our second panel on the political and technical solutions to tackle non-exhaust emissions. And we would like to remind you that the event will be recorded and recordings will be available after the event. You can contribute to the debate by using the chat box, and we will make sure that your comments, questions will be brought forward to the debate. Speakers will have 5 minutes to give their presentation in order to have more time for the questions. And we have the opportunity today to have Jutta Paulus, member of the European Parliament. You are a member of the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, and you are in the Committee on Transport and Tourism, and in the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. Good afternoon, Jutta Paulus.
Hello.
Hello. Dr. Sebastian Gramstadt, you are an expert on non-exhaust emissions at Volkswagen Auto Group with 12 brands from 7 European countries and one of the world's largest automakers by sales. Good afternoon, Sebastian.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Christophe Roccaserra, you are the CEO of Talano, a French company which developed a technology that can substantially reduce brake particle emissions in mass and number for road and rail vehicles. Good afternoon, Christophe.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the invitation.
Jutta Paulus, with the European institution, what can the European institution do to tackle the non-exhaust emissions issues?
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for inviting me in the first place. I think this is really important and interesting to debate about this issue. I listened very carefully on the first panel, and I'm really interested in receiving the slides, by the way, so to have a closer look at them. Well, actually, it was a bit of déjà vu, because when I first entered Parliament 2 years ago, I inherited, so to speak, a file which had been started in the mandate before, and this was the tire labeling file, where the Parliament had already agreed on a position and the Council likewise. So we went right into trilogue, and I had to read a lot on what had already been happening. And in the trilogue, we managed to achieve that the Commission should at least look at a measuring method for tire abrasion. So the particles that are coming from tires, the tire wear, and eventually when a measuring method is there, also show it on the label so that the consumer can see, okay, this tire is setting free more particles than the other. And of course, this is closely correlated with the lifetime of a tire, because the more particles it loses, the sooner it will be broken, or you'll have to change it. So for the consumer, it's a double plus. It's good for the environment, and it's good for your own purse. So therefore, I had been interested in this issue of particulate matter, non-exhaust particulate matter, quite some years actually, and also coming from Rhineland-Palatinate, where our citizens in the capital of Mainz are suffering from nanoparticles that are not coming from road emissions only, but also from airport. You all know Frankfurt-Main Airport, which is a major source of nanoparticles, ultrafine particulate matter. And we are really looking forward to the WHO coming forward with a method and also with limit values on this much overlooked problem. The slides which we have seen in the first panel are really very well, concerning, so to speak, when you look at the impact that these ultrafine particulate matter can have. I think we have several options policy-wise. First of all, we can apply limit values. That's what we have been doing in air quality measures all the time. And of course, it takes a long time until those limit values are actually reached. And sometimes the European Commission even has to take member states to court, as it has done with with Germany, with my home country today, with success. I'm really glad about this, because our transport ministry is not very enthusiastic about tackling air pollution. But I think we could also talk about pricing. For example, it's a totally different matter, but still, Norway has been tackling methane emissions from oil and gas production in a twofold manner. They have imposed a ban, which will come inevitably until a certain date, but at the same time, they have priced the methane emissions so that the industry not only knew, okay, we have a timeline until a certain end date, and until then we have to be close to the technically feasible, but meanwhile, the early bird catches the worm. The early bird will not have to pay the fines. So there was actually an incentive to act by 2025. I'm not sure whether it was the correct year, by the latest, but also an incentive to act earlier, because it will save you money. And I think that's something that we could look into, because it has not yet been addressed on EU level. Of course, it's difficult because tax issues and anonymity in council is a constant problem, I think, at EU level. What I was thinking about while watching your slides, I think that quite a few EV drivers are challenging themselves on having the longest range, and boasting, well, I took my EV so and so many 100 kilometers because I'm such a good driver. But there's also the other part that just likes to be the first one starting at the traffic light, right? So they are using the engine power to outspeed the Porsches with a gasoline engine. And there, of course, you have a lot of wear and tear on tires and road, because you put so much, I mean, this is physics. This is just basic physics. So I was thinking, first of all, could we think about imposing more speed limits, especially in our cities, which would also be good for road accidents, for less fatalities, for less noise, you know? And secondly, how about limiting engine power? Because then you could not use so much power and could not produce so many particles. Of course, this is a very delicate issue, especially in Germany, where we have this weird love for very, very overpowered cars, and we don't even have a speed limit on motorways, I know. But still, it's something that we could speak about, in my opinion. I will leave it at that. I think we will have a lot of things to discuss anyway. Thank you.
Sure, yes, thank you very much. This is the first time the European Commission is considering setting limits for particle emissions from brakes, and the European Parliament will have the opportunity to take a stance on this issue. And Dr. Sebastian Gramstadt, you are an expert from the Volkswagen Auto Group, and you will give us a perspective from an original equipment manufacturer. And what can the automotive industry help to decrease the non-exhaust emissions of its vehicles?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for this opportunity to talk today. So I think we can start with the directly second slide. So go to the motivation, if you don't mind. Thank you. So we have already heard today about non-exhaust emissions coming from brakes, tires, and of course also resuspension plays a certain role. We have also recognized that regulation will be relevant for us in the future, probably not only in the European Union, also probably in the future in the US or also in the Asian markets. But there's also, let's say, internal drive and internal motivation within our group. So, of course, sustainability plays a more and more important role when it comes to the development and, of course, in the end, also to our products. On the next slide, I tried to explain a little bit the complexity of brake particle emissions. On the upper side, on the upper right-hand side of the slide, you see a brake and the emission behavior during a brake application. And as you can see, it is quite complex. So the particles emit not in a very homogeneous way. And since we do not have a tailpipe where we just can connect the measurement devices, it is not very easy to determine particle number and particle mass. Therefore, we use a test bench scenario, testing the brake component itself, but always considering the vehicle-specific parameters. This is very important since we have the same brake for lighter and smaller cars and also for heavier other cars, for instance. So we make a difference when it comes to the actual vehicle application in the end. Of course, it is important to ensure certain points when you want to measure brake particle emissions. First of all, you have to have an appropriate test cycle. In the meantime, and this is a very, very nice example of the work of the PMP group, we have that called WLTP brake cycle that is very sophisticated to test and to determine brake particle emissions, but also to consider the customer-oriented load profile in the end. So it is nothing exotic. It is based on the driving behavior global around the world from the normal passenger car drivers. Additionally, we have to define a robust measurement setup. So this is shown here by the schematic drawing in the middle of the slide. So of course we have to define the dilution length, for instance, where to sample. Of course, I said we do not have a tailpipe. So those points, they have to be defined and clarified. And we have to ensure in the end to be reproducible and repeatable so that we can ensure really robust measurement results in the end, because we must not forget that brake friction couples behave highly nonlinear and they are very sensitive to the environmental conditions like load profiles, like temperatures, like humidity, etc. On the next slide then, we see an example of the potential of reducing those emissions. We have already talked about regen braking. Later on, Christophe will introduce filtration systems or the potentials of filtration system. Regen braking, on the other hand, is something that we have already available when we are talking about electrified cars, hybrids, but of course also battery electric vehicles. One example or one very important point is the reduction of the friction temperature shown on the left-hand side of the slide. So we reduce the friction temperatures by roughly 50%, in some cases even higher. So lower temperatures that means, of course, also lower emissions. And on the right-hand side of the slide, we see the operating conditions, so the range where the region braking is applied. And as you can see quite easily here, hopefully, each blue dot represents a brake application of a customer-oriented endurance run we are using for our development of brake systems. And as you can see, we are in a very wide range where the region braking is applied. So the friction brake will be used in the future more or less only for emergency braking applications, I would say. And this is a very good point, and this makes us quite optimistic that brake emissions can be reduced significantly by the introduction of region braking. On the next slide then, we see a very nice summary also coming from the European Commission when it comes to tire emissions. Tire emissions are also very relevant. We have already heard it. Just want to mention that we have a very, very nice research project that will start now in June during the Horizon 2020 call called LEON-T. The next slide, then I will introduce some more details. And we have the DG GROW activities on the other hand. Both are very, very nice combination, I would say, also to tackle tire wear emissions in the near future. I have to underline here. And yes, thank you. On this slide, then I want to give some facts in regards of this low particle emissions and low noise tires project, short LEON-T. We have also some partners, as you can see within this session here today. We are very happy to be part of it. Just to mention here a few fields of technology. So we want to focus on the wear and particle emission behavior of tires. Very relevant, very important. We only have a poor database so far. The environmental dispersion of microplastics can be derived from those methods we develop in the first step. Also, noise emission of tires plays a very relevant role during this project. And this is then directly linked to the health effects then when it comes, again, to tire noise, but also, of course, to those particle emissions, I would say. And the core is then also a hint, I would say, an advice, how to tackle those issues in the future. So we intend to provide a new tire concept and airless design that is, I think, also a very nice approach. We do not forget, of course, to give here some policy recommendations. This is also, I would say, a very important objective of this result. Yeah, and by mentioning this, I would like to thank you. And I would be very glad, of course, to answer some questions and yeah, to be part of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We understand better the technical challenge that the automotive industry has to cope with, and technical solutions exist and can be implemented right now to drastically reduce the non-exhaust emissions. And we have an example with Christophe Rocasera, CEO of Talano, that can explain his system. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so just wanted to briefly introduce the concept and the solution. I was very interesting to hear all the panelists explaining different topics. We fully agree, I guess, all that those particulate matters cause a real problem. We think that there is a double problem, double topic, a health and environmental issue at the same time, and I think everybody agrees about it. So Talano Technology is a pure engineering company. We do not produce anything. We are a research company, and the company was created 8 years ago. At that moment, we had the Euro 6 regulation, purely focused on the exhaust. We just consider here on this slide the emission of a vehicle. We do not consider the emission of traffic. So no focus on the road emission or resuspension, purely on what is released by the vehicle. So today we can say that for an average Euro 6 vehicle, regulation is only focused on 20% of the emission of the vehicle. The 80% remaining is divided in two with brakes and tires. So we think that it was crucial to find a solution on one of this emission, which is brakes. We are not working on tires. We are a startup, and we have enough to do with brake emission, especially as Dr. Gramstadt explained, because this emission is very complex. So as you can imagine, finding a solution was complex too. But I mean, this is the challenge we had. So next slide, please. So our goal was really to find an answer. So just want to add something positive within this debate, let's say a global solution. So next slide, please. So the solution we developed is a solution which is, in principle, is quite simple. In terms of development, it was much more complex. So it's aspiration at source. And we wanted to develop something which could be applied to all transportation. So for train, we talked briefly during the first panel about train, about also confined environment with subway, which is very important because there the emission is huge, and 70% of the emission of a train is coming from the brakes. So it's important to find a solution, but also for a small urban vehicle, including buses and trucks. The specification of the research we conducted was also to try to find a solution with a low cost of production to be developed globally, adaptable for all brakes, and also with very important level of reduction, which was something very important also for us, and also for retrofit, mostly for trains or buses or trucks, and also for the automotive. So next slide, please. So we aspirate as source. I don't want to explain because it's going to be boring all the technical aspect, but we just aspirate within the paths. By doing this way, we can reduce this emission about 85% in mass. So this is a result we have on all the brake caliper we had worked on recently, but also on the rail. Results are exactly the same, but it's not enough. I mean, as we said, we also have some ultra-fine particulate matters. During all the research we conducted, we found some particle up to 10 nanometers, so PM 0.01, so the size of a virus. So it was crucial to have a global view also about the number of particles we can capture with this technology. And we reached an interesting result because we are capturing up to 90%. And 90% is a figure we reach on urban driving condition, which is interesting because this is where the concentration of particulate matters released by brakes is the most important. And with a low cost of production, so it's always very, very, very expensive, but we reach something in around 300 to 200 euros. And we are quite confident to decrease this price with mass production. And also because, of course, with something which has been tested in every condition. So it works very well. And we've seen that we have the only solution which can bring a solution for the reduction in mass and in number. Next slide, please. And we are also working for rail. For the rail, we developed a solution which is more or less the same. Next slide, please. So we are today working with SNCF, so the National French Rail Operator. So we are in commercial traffic yet. So the experimentation started in December last year. So it's quite interesting. We're starting to work with the subway in Paris also. And we are working with the subway of Shanghai. We also have a collaboration with the OEM, CRC, the Chinese one. And we are very proud because we have been recently selected by Seoul the subway of Seoul called us to try to develop our solution and to adapt our solution to our trains. So I want to be as brief as possible, and also because the discussion will be very interesting, and to try to answer the question if some people have some question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe. And our event focuses on health and non-tailpipe road emissions. Yet we have to tackle non-exhaust emission everywhere, including from public transport vehicles, such as trains, trams, or buses. Do we need to regulate non-exhaust emissions also from public transport? This can be a question to answer during our second discussion time. And you can still send us your questions on the chat box. The other panelists can also react to any question. And we can start with a question on the goal of the EU is zero emission and climate neutrality in 2050. Why would we want to invest in a new Euro 7 norm where the standards aren't even available yet? And what can we do to improve, to accelerate this process? Do you want to start with Jutta Paulus?
I'm not sure whether I have understood correctly. I mean, of course we will. I mean, my political group advocates for a phase out of the internal combustion engine, right? But we will probably see quite some vehicles which enter the roads before this actually comes true. So that is something that we have to regulate. And also we have been talking about non-exhaust emissions all the time here. So even if every ICE car were exchanged by an electric vehicle, which will not be sufficient to reach our climate goal, we need to change the way we are thinking about mobility. Actually, we would still have the non-exhaust emissions, so we would have to regulate that anyway. Maybe I've misunderstood the question.
No, I think that was yes to the question, and And do we have to regulate public transport also on non-exhaust emission, or do we consider that it's not an health issues at the moment?
Well, you cannot say this is public transport and this is not public transport. I think this is, for example, taxi. Is a taxi public transport or not? Should we regulate taxis separately from other cars? I think not, because they usually spend more time on the road, running more kilometers than the average car. And the same is true for public transport. So we have seen in Germany many cities which actually changed their buses because they could not adhere to EU air quality standards, and they were being sued by Deutsche Umwelthilfe, which is an NGO which has focused on air quality. So for example, the city of Wuppertal exchanged their complete bus fleet by fuel cell buses because of the non-exhaust, because of the emissions, because they had to bring down their NOx values. So of course we cannot leave public transport out of the picture, but that's the but. I think we must do much more to actually support public transport, especially when it comes to rural areas where you have, not like in big cities where the buses and the trams, the metros, whatever, are packed and are much better able to finance themselves than in rural areas. So I think we should look at which financial instruments could be found in order to make public transport more accessible for more people and also more attractive, because if you're living in a rural area where you have like 2 or 3 buses coming along per day, this is not a viable option. That's something that we really have to take care of. Thanks.
If I may add something, regulation is crucial for road transport, especially for automotive. So this is why the Euro 7 regulation will be crucial. But there is no regulation for public transport, and especially for rail. SNCF in France, for example, is self-regulated. So, I mean, the only thing you can have is a political pressure on rail operators, for example, if you want things to move forward. And if you want to have cleaner air, I mean, this is normally, for example, in France or in Germany, in Belgium, this is more or less the same. Normally, the trains belong to the region or the landers, for example. So this is their choice, and this is a political pressure which has to act and to take the decision to self-regulate your trains, for example, for less emission.
Thank you. And we have a question, remarks from Professor Fleming-Cassé regarding Sebastian's announcement on Leon T project. We will assess toxicity of the particles in the project. So I don't. We have a question here. And what incentives do those then can decide on limit values for air pollution need if European air quality limits are reached and WHO guidelines values are within reach? Projections are that this will be met soon as well. That's a question from Professor Fleming-Cassé. Do you want to react, Uta Paulus?
Yes, I'm still trying to understand the question.
Yes.
The question is that we have air quality standard for a number of components, and if you feel that that doesn't cover what we want to have, that is controlling the adverse health effects, would it be that an additional indicator, for instance, would be helpful? Is that feasible? Or and also, if you meet standards, meaning what I experience also in my own country is that there's not much incentives for policymakers to do more because they meet standards and that's their goal. What else can you put on the table to make sure that the air is getting even more cleaner than it already is?
Well, I guess what you could put on this, I mean, there is something on the table already, if I may say so, because we have the effort sharing regulation. So if you as a country are doing better, then you actually would have to, concerning climate, of course. This is not about pollutants, but as we have also learned, pollution is often linked to CO2 emissions, right? So if you're doing better on climate, you actually are able to collect money from those that are not fulfilling their goals. I mean, that's something where Germany will probably have to pay quite a few million of euro because they will not reach their goals under the effort sharing regulation. And even more so as it is going to be tightened due to the new climate goals. I think what would be a possibility also is if we would have something like a living quality index. I mean, at last the Commission, at least that's something that Commissioner Šefčovič promised this morning when he came to the Environmental Committee. The Commission will look in their cost-benefit analysis at additional factors to BIP. So when they're doing cost-benefit analysis for legislation, for legislative proposals, be it a guideline, be it a directive, then they would not only look at what cost is happening on the BIP level, so to speak, what cost for administration, for adaptation, all that, and what benefits on an economical level, but also what will be the health benefits to society. So that could be an angle where we also could incentivize competition between member states, saying, okay, How about you? What are you doing to make the life for your citizens better? And I think that could be a very fruitful competition. So who will be the front runner in health and environmental issues?
Thank you. And yes, if you have some question also from the panelists, not just from the audience, please ask. You can ask. And I have a question from Sebastian Gramstadt. Is on the non-exhaust emission and the link between non-exhaust emissions and the quality of road pavement. On your research, have you ever worked on this topic?
I'm sorry, Matteo, I'm afraid I did not get your question, or this question in particular.
On if there is any link between non-exhaust emissions and the quality of road pavement on your studies. Have you ever?
I think this is then part of the Leon-T projects amongst others, right? So I think this is still under investigation, or this is a work item, I would say. We have to focus on, and yeah, we will do so at least within Leon-T. I'm very sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and Maurizio, you have some remarks. Do you want to share it with the audience, please?
Yeah, no, just on the last two questions. On one, I think there was someone, I think Professor Cassé mentioning additional air quality indicator. In principle, yes. The point is that as far as I can understand, even if someone wanted, we wouldn't be able to fit a figure, because we don't have enough databases and epidemiological studies to say what is the limit. So I think this, we launched a research project on research infrastructure exactly to try establish a methodology, instruments, and so on. Then with this, a kind of minimum network of collecting points, and then maybe after some time we would have a kind of figure, because at the moment I wouldn't know, I wouldn't be able to say what is the number of particles today in the air in this city or whatever. So I think it's simply because of lack of data that it would be difficult to do it. And on the other hand, I know that WHO is supposed to be saying something soon. So I think after that, maybe we have some more clarity. And about pavement, we have been discussing this. This will be, of course, included in Leon-T. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be, let's say, so optimistic, so to say, because the experience is that pavement and tires, the abrasion changes the behavior. So you can have a brand new pavement that is behaving in a way, and 6 months later, it's already behaving in another way. If you consider on top of that, that we have tens of type of pavements, depending on the country, the local conditions, and whatever, I'm a bit, okay, maybe this is personal, don't quote me as a commission position, but I'm a bit skeptical that we could achieve something. In a sense, yes, maybe when it's new, we could achieve something, but 6 months later, the results were different. So I'm wondering if it's, let's say, a long-term perspective, so to say.
Just a small comment on the ultrafine ratio, and that is that there is, of course, quite a lot of data on ultrafines, but there is no systematic monitoring, except maybe in some places like in Germany where they have a network.
Yeah.
But I mean, a few decades ago, the NO2 standard was also not based on health effects data from epidemiology. I mean, that was taken basically as a kind of what the average in major cities on the NO2 level, and let's aim for that. And once we have that, meanwhile, we can set up a monitoring network. So it's a bit of an approach how you take it.
No, it's clear. But the point is that at the moment, as you say, there's a few places where there is a network, and other places there's nothing. So let's see what the WHO comes with, and then let's see if there is any standard.
Yeah, certainly no guideline values, I can tell you.
Okay, so, but I think they will be mentioning this at least as a kind of, so they are starting the first step, if I understand correctly. I hope that that will be enough maybe to look a bit beyond the current state. For sure, monitoring will be, we will start something on monitoring.
Thank you very much. And we have a question for Sebastian Gramstadt. What main businesses, opportunities and challenges do OEMs see in reducing emissions from brakes and tires?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for this question. It is very relevant, of course. I mean, to prepare additional, let's say, countermeasures, to consider additional improvements, this might mean additional efforts in terms of development and also probably in terms of costs in the end. Yeah, so we might need an filtration system, perhaps we might need other brake disc concepts, other brake lining concepts. Usually, and this is an experience, of course, also from the past, this means additional costs. But of course, it is important to find here improvements to enhance the development in the end. And yeah, therefore, we are working very hard. I would say not only us as Volkswagen Group, the entire community, I would say. We are cooperating with PMP, for instance, but also with the CARB in the US and also with Japanese colleagues, just to mention a few examples. And yeah, we are looking for those solutions to introduce them also, of course, into the market as soon as it is possible. Yeah. When it comes to tires, of course, it is also a very relevant point. So we are motivated, I would like to say, to reduce those emissions, to reduce the wear, to ensure a higher mileage also for the customer. This is important, very relevant, but we must not forget also the other characteristics and requirements that tires, but also brakes, have to fulfill. So a tire also has to ensure low noise, for instance, and there might be a certain contradiction when it comes to wear, just to mention a pretty simple example. Yeah. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you very much. And we have a question for Christophe. Can you explain a bit more how TAMIC works and how it can achieve such substantial emission reductions? Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. As I said, in terms of principle, it's quite simple. I mean, we just aspirate, so we implement a small vacuum device within the engine bay plus some connection with pipe to caliper, and we just modify the pads. I don't know if it's going to be clear or not, but I have here a pad. So we modify the pad. I mean, as you can see, we groove the pad. Sorry, we groove the pad. I mean, this groove normally doesn't exist, and the rotation of the disc conducts the particulate matters within this groove. So once more, in terms of principle, it's quite simple. And this is the reason why we can have very high level of reduction of emission. And once more, both in number and in mass. So it means that we could solve partly the health and the environmental topic caused by those brake particulate matters.
Thank you very much. And I have a question for all the panelists, but I think it's more for also with Paulus. I wonder what would look like a regulation for brake emissions.
I would not differentiate between the source of the emissions, but rather apply a toxicity factor. Because that was, for me, that was really an eye-opener in the slides from the first panel, seeing that the particular, it does matter how the particulate matter is composed. So and also there of course, this is a very difficult decision because we have different ways of influence of the particulate matter on human health, but also on the environment. So if you would say, okay, we're looking at oxidation only, you would forget about inflammatory things, you would forget about persistence, for example. So that's a really challenging question, how do you assess the composition and how do you assess the properties of the materials that are actually composing the particular matter which you're trying to regulate. So I would not look at the source, I would rather look at the impact, so to speak. I mean, that's also a bit of a flashback, because when I started my career, let's call it career, after university, we started a chemical lab, and first we were measuring just plain old concentrations of air pollutants, by the way, but in indoor, so formaldehyde, volatile organic compounds, wood preservatives, this kind of things. But then we started in parallel of building up a second branch of ecotoxicology, because concentrations are important, but concentrations are not the only thing that we should look at. And maybe it would be a horizon project worthwhile trying to look at how can we maybe via ecotoxicological examinations assess the toxicity, or let's call it the concern we should have on particulate matter of certain compositions, because we need something that we can measure, else we can't regulate, that's clear. But we should not focus on only saying, okay, so and so much copper, so and so much black carbon, so and so much of this and that compound, because then we could actually lose in a focus on compounds which we might have overlooked. So there, for this approach, it might be worthwhile looking at the combined effect of the particles that we are seeing. And I think what we also should keep in mind is that by this approach, we would actually enforce innovation. For example, if a tire producer says, okay, I have found out if I use different compounds to make my tire, then this will be much less harmful for the environment, because let's say it's biodegradable or it doesn't harm aquatic organisms so much. And I think that's the way where we should go, and which is also addressed in the Zero Pollution Action Plan by the Commission, which came out just this week. Thank you.
Yeah. I agree with Jutta here. I mean, and it's, again, I want to emphasize that as an analogy with nanomaterials, that we should take up a safe and a sustainable by design approach, where already in the design phase of new brake pads or whatever can emit particles, you involve those that can say something about the toxicity and potentially the health impact. Avoiding that you already at the production phase ask, okay, by the way, there is emission. What can I do for human? How is human health affected by those particles? I mean, already at the very design phase, involve those that can say something about adverse health effects and help to promote that the material is actually doing its work, but also reducing or limit the health impacts.
Thank you very much. And for this discussion, and I would like to thank all the panelists for this discussion. And in case your question was not fully answered, or you would like to have an additional question, please do not hesitate to address them to IFA, and you can send them to Matteo at ifa.org, and we'll put it on the chat box, and we'll communicate it to the speakers. And of course, we will circulate a summary of the event as well as a video recording. And now Zoltan Masej-Kusabek will say a few words to conclude this event.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for this. So actually, before moving to the concluding remarks of this debate, which was held under the framework of the EU Green Week, I would like to also bring in a particular aspect. Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, could unfortunately not participate in our event, but if I recall it correctly, 2 days ago, during a Bloomberg Philanthropies partner event, similarly under the EU Green Week, she participated. And during this event, decision makers from cities reasserted their commitments for a Europe with zero pollution, an aspect which was also highlighted during today's discussions. And Anne Hidalgo specifically discussed in her opening remarks how Paris had changed during the pandemic, with the city acting on air pollution by strongly changing the way it approaches mobility. And in her statement, she also mentioned the need to create a strong European framework that supports cities in their low emission zone-based fossil fuel phase out, arguing that Euro 7 should be based on the latest WHO recommendation. And she specifically supported the creation of new, more stringent and far-reaching low-emission zones, and took note of the hazardous effects of braking emissions specifically. So that's also a point to this event, and many points which we heard today. So moving to the conclusions and considering the discussions, the presentations and the whole discussions provided some clear conclusions. It's a bit difficult to be brief and do justice to all topics, but I will do my best. So at least a few very specific messages what I've heard were the followings. So to start with, we've heard that while electric vehicles will solve the tailpipe emission problems, they will not address the issue of non-exhaust emissions and could even lead to an increase thereof. The latest OECD report, which was demonstrated that electric vehicles change non-tailpipe emissions with a shift from brake to tire, and heavier electric vehicles may emit more non-tailpipe particulate matter. So both issues need more attention in the future. Very important message from IFA, that air pollution for IFA, what we heard, that air pollution affects everyone, but not the same way. And hearing the viewpoint of older people who are not a homogeneous community was very valuable additions to this debate. The impact of air pollution on older people also depends on socioeconomic status, their state of health or disability. So this is indeed another issue where more detailed data is needed to capture the reality of health inequalities they might face and how they are affected by different types of emissions. As we engage in further research in times of an epidemic coupled with an infodemic, keeping complex problems easy to understand is crucially important. That could have been the motto of this event. Like measuring air pollution by ordinary people was mentioned as a clear example, which can raise awareness about the various types of emissions. So generally speaking, we have learned more about ultrafine particles as well. So that discussions allowed to touch upon that topic as well, which is indeed an overlooked one. And we have to pay more attention to that aspects of pollution when we discuss the topic further, following the latest updates from the World Health Organizations. I noticed that sustainability acts as an internal driver for reducing the environmental impacts of driving, including by addressing non-exhaust emissions, which is also a very important aspect. So it is not an easy topic, but being technical also reminded us that technology offers some solutions. So that's why understanding better technology is crucial. So various solutions can result more or less pollutions, and some of them can also reduce emissions. So currently, only 20% of particulate matter emissions are regulated, and there is a call for Euro 7 to improve on that by regulating 60% of that. So that those numbers I've noticed. So speaking about the technical aspects, we heard a lot about them today. Those aspects will be finally discussed at political level, and they will be discussed and regulated at the political level. So there is a need for policymakers to better understand all of those aspects. So while technological solutions exist in mass, both in mass and in numbers, policy solutions could be added, resulting in a more regulated vehicle market. Speaking of which, several policy options were mentioned, like air quality limit values, pricing measures. The example of the Norway tax on methane emissions from oil and gas was mentioned, or limits on engine powers. And the very specific measures, speed limits, were particularly highlighted, which could decrease the particulate emissions from vehicle, but also lower noise pollution levels and increase safety, which are indeed additional health benefits. So while there are not always sectoral legislations in all aspects of mobility. It is clear that future regulations should cover all non-tailpipe emissions that can include other sources such as public transport, or although what is public transport could be discussed, trains and metro as well. Many speakers also highlighted the need of multi-level approach. So apart from the national and European policies, both going local and international level are relevant, including, for example, more research, raising awareness, and implement vehicle restriction measures, among others. Finally, let me mention one comment which at least to me indicated that we should never forget the people behind the technicalities and the dry numbers. So the idea we all heard that incentivizing the competition among member states about who will improve the health and environment of people the best could be a healthy competitions, and that's a real good example to humanize sometimes technical issues. So with this, I think we can conclude the event. And what the various presentations and answers to the specific questions from a panel member highlighted is that actually many cities in Europe are struggling to meet the current air pollution limits, which are still below under the current WHO standards. So the debate, at least to me, made it clear that we need more action to meet new EU standards, which are expected to be stricter. And we hope that those will follow the latest WHO limits, so they will be fully aligned whenever they are published. So with that, our event come to an end. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank our excellent speakers for their contributions and commitment. And with their clear presentations and precise answers, I think they made the first steps to make it easier for ordinary people to understand such a technical but relevant public health related topic. I would like to also thank our particularly active and engaged audience. Your sharp questions generated, in my opinion, a very lively discussion and helped everyone better understand this topic. And last but not least, I would like to thank everyone for dedicating your valuable time to IFA to attend the event with us. And we hope you consider this as a good investment and time well spent. As we said earlier, you can follow the future developments related to this area. You can expect the event recordings in your mailbox, also on IFA's YouTube channels, and we will update the event page with also some reflections from our side. There are plenty of actions IFA will implement and plan in the future in the area of health and air pollution, and they will also include non-tailpipe emissions. So you can follow us on social media, on Twitter, to keep in touch. So we are looking forward to seeing you all again at one of IFA's future events. So thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.